Wind tears across the cockpit glass, tracers slice upward in clean, perfect lines. Too many to count, too fast to dodge. A German fighter levels off, closing in on what should have been an easy kill. A single bomber drifting alone, engines shaking, smoke leaking from its tail. But then the sky erupts, not from bombs, from guns. 50 caliber fire lashes out in every direction, ripping the calm out of the morning air. The fighter jerks sideways, metal shears, glass shatters. The pilot never even sees the gunner who hit him. For the first time, he realizes the truth. How do you stop a bomber that hits back harder than the fighters sent to kill it? It isn't just the tale of a bomber with 11 guns and a reputation. It's the moment when German pilots, some of the best in the world, stepped into the fight, certain they understood their enemy, and discovered they didn't. The B-17 wasn't simply durable, it wasn't simply heavy. It changed the logic of air combat. A single aircraft that forced the Luftwaffe to rethink distance, direction, and even the meaning of attack. And underneath all of it sits a deeper truth. Wars don't just turn on weapons, they turn on assumptions. One side believing the old rules still applied, while the other side quietly rewrote the playbook at altitude. By the time the realization hit, it was already too late. And the decisive moment, the one this entire story builds toward, would prove why. Before the firestorms, before the running battles across the upper clouds, the air war over Europe looked deceptively simple. Germany controlled vast territory, ringed with experienced fighter groups. The Luftwaffe had spent years honing interception tactics, and its aces were confident, not by arrogance, but because the math had always favored them. Bombers were predictable. Bombers were slow. Bombers needed escorts. And without escorts, they were victims. So when reports arrived that the Americans were relying on a heavy bomber to strike deep into occupied Europe without fighter cover, German commanders didn't worry. They smirked. The skies between France and the Rhine were their hunting grounds. The Americans, they believed, had brought knives to a gunfight. But geography complicated everything. Most U.S. fighters lacked the range to follow bombers past the coast, leaving entire formations exposed over hundreds of miles. The Luftwaffe understood this gap perfectly, and they treated it like a timed ambush. Wait for the P-47s and P-38s to turn back, then pounce with full force. The Americans knew this too, and still pressed forward. Because the B-17, in theory, was built for exactly this environment. High altitude, tight formations, mutual protection. A flying fortress, yes, but one whose strength depended on discipline more than raw muscle. If a group broke formation, gaps opened. If gaps opened, German fighters slipped in like water through stone. At first, German intelligence underestimated the scale of that firepower. 11 guns on paper didn't mean 11 guns in practice. Pilots assumed blind spots still existed, especially along the tail and belly, the classic attack routes. So they trained recruits to hit from those angles, certain the old doctrines were still valid. But early combat reports hinted at something off. Not wrong, just unsettling. Some fighters were being torn up at surprising distances. Some attacks collapsed before they even reached firing range. And some B-17s, badly damaged, burning, half crippled, somehow kept returning home. A German squadron leader summarized it bluntly. "We misjudged the intervals of their fire." No fiction, no drama, just a professional realizing his calculations were slipping. And there was a larger shift happening in the background, the same kind of shift we explored in our episode on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids. High-altitude battles were no longer simple interceptions. They were sustained duels, stretched across climbing spirals, turning horizons, and ammunition loads that evaporated faster than commanders expected. Slowly, the Luftwaffe felt the pressure building. A new kind of target had entered the sky, one that punished mistakes immediately, one that didn't break the way older bombers did. And yet, German leadership dismissed the warning signs, chalking them up to coincidence or pilot error. They weren't misreading the bomber, they were misreading the battlefield itself. Everything from this point forward tightens around that misunderstanding. Dawn breaks in thin, pale layers. The bomber stream stretches out like a steel spine across the sky. Engines rumble in synchronized vibrations. Oxygen masks hiss. Every gunner settles into the routine. Scan, breathe, adjust. Below them, the countryside slides by in muted colors. Above them, thin streaks of contrails scribble warning signs across the horizon. The Germans are climbing. Fast. Luftwaffe radar stations have tracked the formation for nearly an hour. Squadrons scramble, merge, disperse, and reform into attack wedges. Experienced pilots take the lead. Rookies slot in behind them. The plan is familiar. Frontal assaults first, then tail attacks, then mop up stragglers. But something is off. The bombers aren't sagging out of formation the way older waves often did. They're tight, unnervingly tight. One German officer calls it a wall moving through the sky. Weather adds tension. Thin banks of cloud drift into the bomber's path, breaking visibility, then clearing it just as quickly. Every shadow looks like a fighter. Every shimmer looks like a muzzle flash. The B-17 gunners track movement constantly, hands stiff inside thick gloves. The intercom crackles, a calm voice. "Fighters at 3 o'clock, high." No panic, just preparation. And then the shift begins. The Germans peel into position for the first run. Their engines howl as they climb into the sun, curving over the formation. The bombers brace. 10 seconds. 5. 3. A flash of silver, then a streak of black. The attack begins. The lead German fighters dive in from the front left quarter, the classic angle designed to exploit the bomber's perceived blind arc. Their cannons open up first, long bursts, meant to break formation discipline. The B-17s respond instantly. Front turrets track. Cheek guns swing. A curtain of 50 caliber fire erupts forward with terrifying density. One German fighter disintegrates mid-dive, not from a single hit but from dozens. Pilots expected return fire, yes, but not this. Not this volume, this accuracy, this reach. A second wave attempts a high-side curving attack to avoid the direct frontal cone. It doesn't work. Waist gunners hammer them as they cross, hitting angles German manuals insisted were marginal. Smoke trails carve the air. 2 more fighters drop out, one spinning, one gliding with a dead engine. The Germans reform for tail attacks, their supposed safe route. But the tail gun of a B-17 is no formality. It's a weapon system built for exactly this moment. As 4 fighters line up, the B-17 tail gunners open fire with overlapping arcs. Tracers arc backward like burning needles. 1:45. One fighter pulls away with its canopy shredded. Another never pulls away at all. 2:10. A German pilot radios a warning to his unit. Not panicked, just stunned. They have no weak angle. 2:30. The formation hits turbulence but holds. Even damaged aircraft maintain position. One B-17 loses an engine, but stays in the line, its crew compensating, refusing to drift. 3. The Germans try a coordinated mass attack. the tactic that always cracks bombers eventually. It fails almost instantly. The B-17s are simply outputting too much firepower. A Luftwaffe after-action report would later summarize this moment as, "We entered a zone in which every second was lethal." Inside the bombers, the experience is nothing like confidence. It's noise, recoil, vibration, a constant wrestling match against fear and cold. Gunners fire until their hands tremble. Shell casings bounce across the floor. The smell of cordite mixes with the thin oxygen so sharply it stings their eyes. A waist gunner sees a fighter spiraling down and whispers something into his mask. Not a cheer, just a breath of relief. Another gunner keeps shooting even after blood starts leaking from a cut on his cheek, caused by flying metal. He doesn't mention it. There's no point. In the cockpit, the pilot feels the aircraft shaking from hits. A wing puncture, a tail strike, a chunk torn from the elevator. But the fortress holds. These crews aren't fearless. They're disciplined. Meanwhile, on the German side, the shock becomes visible. Pilots land with ammunition untouched because they never got close enough to fire. Mechanics count holes in returning aircraft that look impossible. Wings stitched by 50-cal rounds, fuselages punched through, engines seizing. One pilot, interviewed long after the war, said simply, "We thought it was one machine. It was one gun platform." When the smoke begins to thin, a clearer picture emerges. The Germans retreat not in surrender, but in recalculation. Their losses are too steep, the formation too intact. They expected stragglers, easy kills trailing behind. There are none. The B-17s continue forward, dented, battered, leaking fuel, but moving with the same grim momentum. Something fundamental has shifted. The Luftwaffe realizes the flying fortress wasn't just harder to kill, it was reshaping the battlefield around it. Attack angles once considered safe were suddenly lethal. Distances once considered optimal were suddenly exposed. Doctrines refined since Spain and Poland and France were suddenly obsolete. This is the moment when confidence turns into doubt. Not panic, just the quiet, heavy awareness that the old assumptions no longer apply. And then everything changed. The B-17 would not win the air war alone. But from this moment forward, no German pilot underestimated it again. When the bomber groups finally turned for home, the skies behind them looked carved apart. Drifting smoke columns, thin contrails broken mid-line, and scattered fragments of aircraft falling through quiet air. But what mattered wasn't just survival. It was what the Germans learned in those minutes of combat. The Luftwaffe's leadership now faced a truth they hadn't planned for. Their standard interception tactics were no longer reliable. The B-17 hadn't shattered their air arm, but it had cracked the foundation of how they fought. Commanders gathered reports from returning pilots. Attacks halted mid-run, formations that refused to break, gun arcs that punched holes in long-trusted approaches. What unsettled them wasn't the bomber's durability. They'd seen tough aircraft before. It was its offensive power, a defensive platform behaving like a moving fortress of crossfire. Tacticians scrambled. They shifted to heavier weapons. They began experimenting with rockets. They tried attacking from steep vertical dives to escape the kill zones. Some units even tested head-on mass charges, hoping sheer momentum could punch through. But each workaround came with a cost: higher fuel use, greater exposure, and losses that grew faster than replacements could keep up. The strategic consequence rippled outward. If Germany couldn't reliably stop American bombers in daylight, then the Allies could eventually hit anything: refineries, factories, rail junctions, ball-bearing plants, the skeleton of the German war machine. Meanwhile, American planners reviewed a different set of lessons. The B-17 worked. Its firepower worked. But its true strength only emerged in tight formations, and even then, the losses were heavy. The message was clear. The bombers could reach deep into Europe, but only at great cost, and only until long-range escorts arrived to finish the equation. Still, this moment carried weight for both sides. The Germans saw an enemy machine they had underestimated. The Americans saw a battlefield that demanded evolution. And the war in the air shifted its momentum 1 inch at a time, sometimes through factories, sometimes through strategy, but often through the raw shock of first contact. If you love real World War II stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, subscribe for more. Behind the smoke of this battle waits the reveal, the part history often forgets, but pilots never did. Here's the part that rarely makes the documentaries, the part buried inside pilot logs and after-action reports, the part that explains why the B-17 shook the Luftwaffe so deeply. It wasn't the armor, it wasn't the altitude, it wasn't even the guns themselves. It was the geometry of the formation. German pilots assumed they were fighting individual aircraft. They weren't. They were fighting a network. Dozens of overlapping firing arcs, each gunner protecting not just his own bomber, but the bomber beside him. Every move a fighter made triggered a response from multiple angles. Every attack lane was covered by someone the pilot couldn't see. The fortress was never meant to be a lone machine. It was designed to be part of a machine that stretched across miles of sky. And the irony is sharp. The moments when German pilots felt the bomber's unexpected firepower the most were often the moments when they weren't being shot by the bomber they were targeting at all. They were being hit by its neighbors, invisible allies, a web of defenses no single gun could have produced. That was the hidden truth. Not that the B-17 was unstoppable, but that the Luftwaffe misunderstood what it was. Not a fortress. A formation that became one. A lesson realized only after they were already inside its range. In the end, the fighters broke off, leaving the bombers to push through the cold silence they'd carved into the sky. The B-17s didn't look victorious. They looked wounded, scorched, alive only because their crews refused to let go. But the Germans saw something else in those formations, a battlefield that no longer belonged to them. And that's the part history remembers, even if quietly. Because in the end, the Germans didn't fear the B-17's bombs. They feared what its guns turned the sky into. Next time, we step into the story from the other side. The day German engineers tried to build a bomber killer powerful enough to reclaim the air. It's wars and myths, and these are the war stories they never told in school.